One of the things we need to remember is that the High Middle Ages, the medieval period is divided typically into three periods. The early, the middle, and the late. Or the early, the high, and the late. I think the reason they don't call it the middle is it would then be the Middle Ages. And that sounds like maybe you're not saying it right. The High Middle Ages is what we're going to talk about today. Last time we talked about the early Middle Ages, which goes from the fall of Rome, so let's say roughly around 500 AD, to about 1,000, so about 500-600 years of history. Today we're going to talk about 250 to 300 years of history, and then Thursday we're going to talk about 150 to 200 years of history. All of that's medieval history. Some people call this the Dark Ages. Why do you think they would call it the Dark Ages? Did I give you the sign-in sheet?
Yeah.
I did, didn't I? Okay, good. Well, why do you think they would call it? What does that make you think of when I say, oh, this is the Dark Ages?
Plague.
The plague, yeah, everybody says that. Technologically behind. Anything else? Would make it dark. Yeah, technology behind death, Black Plague. Well, a lot of times people say, well, nobody knew how to read or write. So there's dark. Nobody's writing anything, so it's dark. There's no light of knowledge. Yeah. Well, I don't use that term Dark Ages. Most people who study medieval history don't use it. They don't like it. Because they say, well, everybody thinks nothing happened from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. So like 1,000 years in Europe, just nothing happened, right? But that's really not true, and that's what we're going to highlight today. We talked last time about Charlemagne. Remember, you're supposed to be reading Charlemagne, not for this Sunday, but next Sunday you have a quiz on Charlemagne. There is a link there that you can click on. It's in it's on MyFire. And you just click on it, it'll take you there, and you can read it online. You don't need to buy the book, okay? All right. But Charlemagne certainly started a Renaissance we talked about during his period. Now this is called the High Middle Ages because it has a high population. You might call it the High Middle Ages because they have very high buildings that they build. They build cathedrals. You might call it the High Middle Ages because they created, this is where universities began. This is where you are. You're at a university. All universities then began in the medieval period in Europe. Wow. This period of darkness and no knowledge and no innovation. How could all these new things happen? Well, they do. So, we need to start with, we said, well, technology. They're behind in technology. They're behind in innovation. Well, in the High Middle Ages, there is innovation. In fact, there's quite a bit of engineering, innovation, and building. One of those areas is in agriculture. Now, that's something we don't usually talk about. But part of the problem is they had been farming like they had farmed in the Roman period. They were sort of stuck in that. And the Roman Mediterranean had a different soil, had a different climate than in Europe, north of the Alps. And so they needed a heavier plow. But to have a heavier plow, the Romans had a very light plow because the soil was thin. Here they got deep soil, so they need a heavier plow. To do that, you got to have some way to pull the plow. I don't know if you've ever worked on a farm, worked with a plow, but at one point they used to have people pulling the plows. Pretty hard work. Then they would get like a donkey or a mule or something to pull it. But when you want a really heavy plow, you need a big horse. Big horses like we got pictured here. Plow horses. These are work horses, right? Like those Clydesdales and those sort of, these are massive horses that get developed. There's different breeds. But they also use oxen. Now, what is an ox or an oxen? What's that? A bull. Yes, it's bull adjacent. It was previously a bull. You know, there are certain things you can do to a bull, so it's not really a bull anymore. We're not going to talk about it in here. It's kind of like my little dog, Xerxes. It was a little boy dog, but I took him to the doctor. He got fixed. And then Xerxes looked up at me, and, you know, he can't actually talk, but sometimes I think he can. And he said to me, "You knew what they were going to do. There was nothing broken, nothing needed to be fixed." That's what he told me. My mother used to call it getting fixed, yeah. Well, anyway, that's what you do to a bull, and you got an ox, all right? So whatever your imagination is there, I'll let you go with it. But that's what it is. So it's a very large animal. It's a very powerful animal. But since it has been fixed, it's more docile. You know, bulls can be pretty mean. And if you ever encounter a real bull, he may not be a nice encounter. He's going to chase you and knock you around. It's not nice. So, oxen and horses, large horses. Now you also need, if you want to get more than 1 horsepower out of this, you need more than 1 horse, right? If you start hooking up more than 1 animal to a plow or a wagon, it's going to take some technology and figure out. Just take a look at all this gear on these horses. Somebody had to figure all that out. Somebody had to make it. Somebody had to design it so that it would all work. You have a double tree. You've got, it's called, you know, you need little pieces of wood here that keeps these horses pulling together. If the horses, for example, if you got 2 horses and they're not hooked up right, one horse may go sort of to the left and the other one to the right, and they end up pulling against each other instead of pulling against the plow or the horse or the wagon. So you need them to be hooked together in the right way. Also, they redesigned the horse collar, which pushes it down on the shoulders of the horse more rather than up higher on the neck. So they have more power, more torque, more horsepower, right? And so anyway, with this new kind of plow and new sort of technology of farming, they now can get more land and they can turn over deeper soil that had never been farmed before, and that was very rich soil. So they start getting a higher yield per acre. And that's what farmers are looking for, right? How much do you get per acre? In Europe, they might call it a hectare, but it's the same idea. What's our yield going to be from this piece of land? That's going to go up. And when that goes up, you know what happens? Food supplies go up. We got more wheat. We got more barley. We got more of all the crops. And then guess what? That means that our population goes up. Because what we had here was a subsistence economy. Anybody know what subsistence means? If I say this is these people are living at a subsistence level, or it's a subsistence economy. Any ideas? I mean, it's a real English word. Okay, yeah, you're getting at the heart of it. You just have enough for yourself. That's what subsistence, it means. If, you know, in other words, another way we put it is hand to mouth. So you have a job, and when you get your paycheck, every penny is spent before you get it, right? I mean, you need every single dollar, just to make it. I just got enough to pay my rent, just got enough to pay for my food. And when you're farming, it means you just got enough food that your family can survive. But the one thing you got to remember is you got to save some of that seed so you can plant it next spring, right? If you eat it all up, come spring, you got nothing to plant. So that's subsistence, where you're barely making it. All right. When you're living that way, that means that a lot of people are going to bed hungry. And a lot of people are they're not at the optimum weight, at optimum health. So what that means then, any little thing can bring trouble. Any kind of sickness might get magnified. Or, for example, a woman who gets pregnant. A woman who gets pregnant who is of too low of a weight or not good enough health means that the woman may well not survive the pregnancy, and the baby, the child, may not survive. So this is really where a lot of that population double happens, is that the women survive childbearing better, and the children, the infant, survives better. Because they have just a little bit more food. A little bit more food makes a lot of difference. And the population will then double, right? Today, in the United States anyway, we don't have, well, I won't say it never happens, but the rate of, say, a woman dying while giving birth is pretty low. And same for a child dying during the birth process. And also we have so many vaccines and we have so many medicines and so forth that most children who are born survive to adulthood. That was not the case in the medieval period. I'd say at least 50% of children died before they would be of the age where they would have children, before they mature. And the highest mortality rate for women was while they were giving birth to a child. So for example, if you make it out of your childhood, right, maybe half of you make it out of your childhood, if you happen to be a woman, about the time you're making it out of your childhood, you start having babies. And to make it out of that period where you're no longer having babies, well, a lot of women didn't make it out of that period. You see what I'm saying? So, anyway, I'm not giving you any hard and fast numbers there, but basically that's how this thing can double so quickly, is that the women are healthier, they survive more at a higher rate, and the children and the infants survive at a higher rate. So we see then the population doubling. These are estimated populations of Western Europe, 35 to 40 million, to now 70 to 80 million in that 250-year period. This is going to lead to urbanization and specialization. A lot of people moving into cities and towns, and they're going to really grow. And with that excess population now, we don't need everybody on the farm. We're going to send people into town, and they're going to learn to do specialized things. Because we're going to need more things, like more blacksmiths, more tailors, more bakers. Somebody needs to do those jobs, and that's what's going to happen. So what that means is, if you are growing up on the farm, unlike the way it's been for hundreds of years, where you're just going to have the same job as your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents, you now have a chance to go into the town or the city and learn to do trade, or have a very different life. So here we see them winnowing. Look at this. I want to put this here. See these poles sticking up? This is the way they made fences. This is also the way they build buildings. It's called wattle. Wattle's where you take upright wooden poles and then you bend sticks between it that are bendable. They're green enough they bend. Then they dry out. And then the other thing they put on is called daub, D-A-B. Wattle, W-A-D-D-L-E, and daub, D-A-B. Daub is basically a mixture of mud, sometimes manure, and they throw it up against there and it sticks and you make it airtight. That's how you make a building. You put a roof on it. That's how you make a wall or a fence to keep animals in. Anyway, and here we see them winnowing. There's a lot of work, a lot of labor involved in all of this. So we start to see cities really begin to grow. Milan, of course, is in Italy. It grows 5 times in 250 years. So it goes from 20,000 to 100,000. North of the Alps, more common for cities to double. With the exception of Paris. Paris grows 5 times in this period to about 100,000. It becomes the largest city north of the Alps. The other thing that begins to be high, not only population, but cathedrals. Each of these cities begins to build a very large church building. Cathedral actually comes from the Latin word cathedra, which means chair. And technically a cathedral can only be called a cathedral if a bishop resides in that building. That's the church building of the bishop is the place where the bishop's chair is, and therefore the cathedral, because it has the cathedra, the chair of the bishop. Now, there could be other large churches that we call cathedrals that really technically aren't. But here I'm talking about a cathedral in each of these cities, and they will try to build theirs taller and more fabulous, and more famous than the others. This is sort of the way that, like New York and Chicago used to compete back and forth, having the tallest building in the world. They've kind of given up on that since 9/11, I think. I don't think we're going to find that, at least in the United States, for a while. Now we see it in the Middle East. People are building really high buildings, Dubai and places. But it was to be bragging rights. It's for tourism. It's to say we have the biggest building, the tallest building. Okay? So, high cathedrals. We also see a move from illiterate to literate society where written records become much more important. And the more that written records are used, the less that memory is used or relied upon. We've gotten to the point now where people don't trust their memory much at all, right? And so we see that the written records then become the most important thing. So think about it. If somebody showed up, if your father, your grandfather, everybody in your family had told you, like, these are the property lines. Some other guy shows up one day and you've got a piece of paper and he says, this is not your property line. Who would you want to trust? The guy you don't know with a piece of paper you probably can't read? Or your own parents, grandparents, so forth? Well, it's a big change. And basically it's going to be facilitated by larger population, larger government, more paperwork. And a lot of this has to do with taxes and laws. They want everybody to know the laws, so they write it down. And if you say, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that, well, it's written right here. Why did you do it? And they say, oh, you didn't pay all your taxes. Well, I didn't know I had to pay that. It's written right here. You haven't paid your taxes this year. How do you know I haven't paid my taxes? It's not written down here. See? So this is the way we still operate today. That we moved it to electronic forms, but it's still documents, written documents, numeric documents that are stored. And that's what makes our world go around today. If you could suddenly erase all of the Visa, MasterCard, student loan information from you, wouldn't that make your day easier? You could be debt-free immediately. Just if they didn't exist? Well, don't worry, they have backups. I'm sure they got multiple backups. They don't lose money. Well, financial records, very important, and we have a very complex royal administration. So, and here we see a picture of a guy in a scriptorium where a lot of this writing would take place. Remember, all the writing has to be done manually, by hand, by a person, sitting there with a quill and transcribing it. You see, that's what he's doing here. You see the lines are drawn, and this guy is writing, and he'll write the next line, next line. How this would often work is somebody would be in the front of the room, kind of like I am. I would have a document. I would read a line. You would write a line down. I would read the line again. You would double check it. Then we'd move to the next line. And we just keep going like that until we made our way all the way through the entire document, the book. When we got done, we would have 30 copies, which would be very valuable, but very hard, very time-consuming to make. And a lot of it would depend on the skill of the individual scribe to write the right thing and to write it in a way that you can read it. Some of your writing is not easy to read. I'll just tell you that. So you need to write it in a way that somebody can actually read it. Well, if we say that, nothing's happening, how about the beginnings of universities? We need people to be educated, to do these jobs. How are we going to do that? Well, we do that by creating universities. These kind of grow out. Most of the education had been done through monasteries, but then it began to move to cathedral schools, and then the cathedral schools didn't have enough room, so they actually created a university. And the universities that we have, the earliest universities were all started by the church. So today we tend to think of state universities as being the standard universities, church universities as being the you know, strange one, right? Not the normal one. But in fact, it's the other way around. Universities were all started by churches. And then it wasn't until after, here in the United States, until after the Civil War, about 1880, 1885, something like that, that state universities actually began. So they've only been around a little over 100 years. And of course, they get state funding, so that helps them. They got free state land to start with to build the university, free land, and they get annual money, and they get tax money. And so that's what's helped them really grow. Okay? Well, anyway, they all started that way. Even the biggest schools, most famous schools, like Harvard and Yale and, all those kinds of schools were all church-started schools when they began. All right? Brown, all those Ivy League schools were definitely. All right. So what this meant was, now with the university and the new population, there's social mobility. That means you can change your life. Your life would not have to be identical to your parents' life. Okay? If you were clever enough, you could go to the university, you could learn how to read and write, you could learn how to do a lot of these things, and you might end up as working for the king, keeping records, or a bishop, or in a court system, writing down laws or decrees or judgments. All right? So universities began. So you talk about innovation? Yes, universities. Talk about architecture? Yes, cathedrals. Talk about technology? Well, agricultural technology, yes. So a lot of things are happening in the High Middle Ages, and the population is growing. Lots of things are moving. Lots of things are happening. Lots of monastic orders are forming. A lot of people want to get serious about their spirituality. A lot of new opportunities in the cities with guilds. A guild is kind of hard to explain. It's sort of like a union, but it controls an entire trade. The only thing we have close to it today, I guess, would be the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association controls the medical colleges. It controls the doctors and their licensing. It controls the number of doctors. We always talk about, we need more doctors. You know why we don't have more doctors? The American Medical Association. They don't want there to be a lot of doctors. Why? If there were a lot of doctors, guess what? Doctors would get paid less. It's supply and demand. If you had too many doctors, the price of going to see a doctor would decline. If we regulate how many people can become doctors, and they do, then you keep the price, the access to doctors becomes more difficult, the price therefore becomes higher. Compare that with, say, lawyers. We got millions of lawyers. We got lawyers out there desperate for people to come to them. But they'll come to you and they'll work for you for free. They'll say, we're not going to charge you a penny unless we get you some money, then we want to cut. So doctors never going to do that. Doctors are going to say, you never come to me, and if I don't cure you, you don't have to pay me anything. Right? Just to get you to come to me. Well, anyway. Think about it. That's what they had. So they'd have a guild. Let's say you had 3 sons. You might take one of your sons into the village and take him to the blacksmith and say, my son here is strong. He's a hard worker. Could my son be with you, study with you, become a blacksmith with you, work for you? And maybe the blacksmith would say yes, but then what your son would have to do, probably about the age of 9 or 10, your son would then be an apprentice to the blacksmith. The son would receive no pay, a place to sleep, probably in the shop in the corner on a mat, and get some food. And that's it. But be trained to be a blacksmith. Learn more and more, till eventually, after 7 years of apprenticeship, could then apply with the guild to become a master of the craft by producing a masterpiece. That's where we get the word masterpiece. And if it's accepted by the guild, then he would be a master of the craft, still wouldn't have his own shop, would then be paid for working for the blacksmith or some other blacksmith. And then eventually, when there was an opening, because they don't want there to be too many blacksmiths, If everybody is a blacksmith, we've got too many blacksmiths, guess what? The blacksmith's rates go down. So they say, in this town, there's only going to be one blacksmith or two blacksmiths. That's it. We're not going to have any other shops. You're going to have to go to another town where they need it if you want your own shop. That's how they would control it. And it was controlled by the blacksmith guild, by the bakers guild, by the, whatever. All right? So that's the guild. That's a big part of their society. We also start to see that there are autobiographies, a change in literature. Autobiographies begin to be written. And, there hadn't been one since Augustine. St. Augustine wrote his autobiography. I don't know if you've ever learned about Augustine. We've mentioned him in here briefly, but he was an early church leader, father. He wrote his Confessions, where he confessed all the bad stuff he had done and how he had changed. And he wrote a kind of biography of himself. So an autobiography. Why do you think there had not been any autobiographies in, I guess in this case, about at least 500 years or more? Autobiography.
There's too many wars, and
People don't have the time to do it?
or resources.
Resources? Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to survive, you're probably not going to sit down and write stuff.
Yeah.
You have to know how to write, read and write. A lot of people didn't. You have to have the resources. There's one more thing. Humility. During the Middle Ages, they were very concerned about being humble, following God. It just didn't seem very humble to write about yourself. In fact, writing about yourself is like the least humble thing you can do. Right? Because you're saying, hey, this is me. Read about me. I'm writing about me. I'm important. You should read about me. Now, of course, in our society today, we're kind of all about me, or all about you, or whatever, all about us. Everything's about me. So, I have a Facebook page, and guess whose face is on it? Mine. Not yours, not somebody else, but me. Everything on it is about me. Instagram, it's all about me. We don't even have people take pictures of us anymore. We do it ourselves. We like to do it ourselves. Sometimes I'll see two people trying to take a picture, and I'll say, hey, I used to say, you want me to, take the picture for you? No, we want to do it. They get a weird angle, and they want to do it and get it just the right way so that when they put it on there, just the right picture, just the right angle, it has just the right message. And I'm not going to be able to do that because they not only want to be the subject of the photo, they want to be the photographer as well. It's all about me. So we're very used to that. So the humility of the Middle Ages seems a little foreign to us. But they would say, no, I don't think I should write about myself. That's too, just ask me how humble I am, I'll tell you. Well, one of the most famous of these autobiographies is Peter Abelard. He writes an autobiography. He's a monk. Here's a picture of him with his lady friend, Heloise. Now, he and Heloise were an item. They were a thing. Well, he wasn't a monk at the time, but her family was not very happy about it. So, in fact, her family, remember I talked about my dog Xerxes being fixed? Abelard was fixed by Heloise's family to make sure that and then to make it doubly sure, he was sent off to a monastery and she was sent off to be a nun. So they were separated, and
Those are some pretty protective parents.
they were separated, things were separated, and then people were separated to make sure this didn't happen. But guess what? Their love survived. To start playing the music, because even though they couldn't see each other, they wrote letters to each other. And you could read those letters. The letters of Abelard and Heloise.
It's alive.
Yeah.
The letters.
I'm sure you can find them online for free to read, or go to the library. Yeah, they're there. And they write, well, they tell about what they're doing. And they're probably not the kind of gushy letters maybe you're hoping for, but they do talk about their love and how they care and how they keep in touch, even though they are separated.
And fixed.
Well, I wasn't going to say that part, but yes. Their love lives on. Isn't that what matters? No?
Did they
All
ever
right.
meet again?
You have to read the book. I don't want to, spoiler alert.
Oh, okay.
I got to leave something for you to watch. I'm sure they've made a movie about it too. I don't know. I just haven't watched it. If they haven't, they should. Don't you think that'd be a good movie?
Yes.
About the love? Well, I may not want to show some scenes, but the love lives on. All right, another thing happens during the High Middle Ages. Crusades. Crusades take place. Crusades comes from a Latin word crusada. Crusada means cross. Cross. So it gets that name because the soldiers would actually wear crosses on their uniforms. In fact, they would go out and recruit guys to go on a crusade, and they would have cloth crosses up front here, and they would say, who will come and take up the cross, and take up this burden to go on a crusade? And they have a ceremony, and people would walk up and pick that up, and then they would sew that on their clothes, and they would wear it as a symbol that it was a religious act. That's what you have to remember. The Crusades were done to save, in their opinion, they were saving the Holy Land. They were liberating the Holy Land from Muslims, infidels, who didn't believe in Christ, who controlled the places where Jesus was born, where he was crucified, where he was resurrected, where he performed his miracles, where all these things of the Bible had happened. And here you have infidels who control that. They took it over. They killed a lot of Christians and took it over, and we're going to go and liberate it. And it becomes an act of religious devotion. That's really what it is. Well, anyway, how could it be possible? Well, the unity of the Muslims had collapsed. We had talked about that when we talked about Islam. And the Muslims control the holy places. I think for the Europeans, that was one of the most important ones, number 2. Muslims control the holy places. We need to liberate those holy places so that Christian pilgrims and Christians can travel back and reconnect with Jesus, reconnect with the Holy Land. We even call it the Holy Land still today. People still go, thousands of people, probably millions of people go every year because it is the Holy Land. And they take tours. And they go around to Bethlehem, and they go to Jerusalem, and they go to these, all these places. Right? Because they want to be close to it. Also remember, there are Muslims in Spain. And these Muslims in Spain, if you remember, when we talked last time, we talked about how the Muslims had invaded the Battle of Tours. You remember that? The Battle of Tours or Poitiers, when they had attacked, they had been driven back. The Muslims are still in Spain. And there's still, many people thought of them as a threat. They might invade us again. So, ironically, we're going to go attack Muslims far from there because we've got Muslims pretty close to us. And it keeps us on our mind. By the way, this is the most famous, best preserved of all the Crusader castles, Crac de Chevalier, the castle of the soldiers. And I've been there, I don't know, 5 times, 6 times. I haven't been there in about a decade. Why? Because there's been a civil war in Syria. And unfortunately, I've heard this has been shelled by the army. So hopefully it's not in too bad a shape. But it was beautiful. It's pristine. They used it for movies and things. I mean, it's an amazing place. But that's in the mountains of Syria. I took this, actually, I was eating lunch at a place. And this is what you saw right out as you were sitting and eating lunch. I would take the students there, we'd eat lunch, and we'd go and explore the castle. It was really, students really loved this place. I don't know why you wouldn't, because it's just like something out of a movie, really. Just walk all around. Well, what else were the reasons for the Crusades? Well, I got 3 more. One is people were getting more serious about their religion, more devoted, I guess I might say. There were a lot of monastic movements where they're calling for a piety and that sort of thing, the Cluniac movement. And so what could be more pious than be willing to sacrifice your life to go to the Holy Land and liberate it from infidels? Well, the immediate cause was Alexis I, the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, was being attacked by Seljuk Turks, who were Muslims, and they were trying to take over his land in what we call Turkey today. So I guess you see how that ended. So he was being threatened, and so he called upon the Christians in the West to come help him, and he wanted them to send soldiers to him to help him. Well, it's interesting how that didn't really work out that well the way he wanted it to. Also, it could be an opportunity for younger nobles, is what some people said. I don't know how much that's true, because, I guess it could be an adventure. You could go off to battle and see the world, and I guess if you survive, come back and tell stories. Impress the ladies. All right? So there we go. Crusades. Let's move on. We're going to talk about a few, I think 4 of the Crusades. There are several, but we'll just highlight 4 or 5 of the Crusades. First one, 1096 to 1099. Pope Urban II, that's a guy pictured here. He gets the message from Alexis, the emperor, asking for help. But what he does is he kind of rereads it. He doesn't say, hey, we need people to go help the Byzantine emperor fight the Seljuk Turks so the Byzantine emperor can keep his property. He says, you know what? We Christians need to go fight the Muslims, but we really need to liberate the holy places. We need to liberate the Holy Land. We need to take the holy city back, Jerusalem. Remember, the Muslims had invaded and taken that. It had been Christian land. And now it's in the hand of non-Christians, of infidels, people who don't believe Christ is God in the flesh. And not only that, but there are many pilgrims who are being killed, harassed, who try to go visit the holy places. And he offers plenary remission of sins if you die while on the crusade. What does the word plenary mean? Anybody know? Plenary. It is an English word. Absolute, that's pretty close. Yeah, it really means whole or complete. I can see how you get absolute out of that, perhaps. Like, for example, when I go to a conference, I go to these conferences, a couple of them a year, and they will have lots of different sessions going on at once. But then they will have some sessions that are plenary. That means that no other sessions are going on. There's just this one session. Everybody's supposed to go to that one session and listen to the one person talking at that time. Otherwise, there might be 50 things going on at once, except for the plenary session. Are you going to the plenary? Are you going to the plenary session? My answer is usually no. Okay. Anyway. I sometimes go. Now, they even freed up prisoners and let them go. Why not give them a shot? Give them a shot. They're in trouble anyway. If they die en route, well, they get out of, they don't even have to go to purgatory. We don't have time to talk about it, but they believed at that time, when you died, unless you were a saint, you were going to purgatory, and maybe going to purgatory for a long time before you ever went to heaven. You were eventually going to heaven, you had to go to purgatory first. But if you died on the crusade, boom, go directly to heaven. Do not pass purgatory, do not have to pay in purgatory. You go straight there. Complete remission of sins. Well, that's the first crusade. Now here's the route of the first crusade. I won't say too much about it other than to say that you can see a lot of them are coming from France. Some are coming from Germany, some from Italy, but they all converge on Constantinople. And, the emperor is a little nervous about these guys. They don't seem to be very loyal. And so he says, I'll tell you what, why don't you guys go across here and attack the city of Nicaea? I got some enemies there. Why don't you go over there and take care of that for me? And they do. Turns out that's a Christian city. You ever heard of the Nicene Creed? That's where it was originated about 700 years earlier. But basically, these people were in dispute with the emperor, and so he let them knock that out for him. Then they went on across here. This was very tough for them because people were poisoning the wells. It was very hot, and they got sick. They finally make it, and they attacked Edessa, took it. That was also a Christian city. And then they went to Antioch. Antioch was not a Christian city at the time. It was controlled by Muslims. And then they moved south to Jerusalem, 1099, took the city. So they moved in large groups under the Red Cross. In fact, the first people to arrive are not even trained soldiers. It's a mob of people. It's peasants who hear about this and they want to go. They have religious devotion. Say, we're going to go and liberate the Holy Lands from the infidels. And they weren't quite sure where they were going, how far it was. They didn't have GPS. They get to Constantinople, and when he saw them, rabble, mob, he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you people. I'll put you on some boats, send you across the water. Go south, you'll meet a lot of Muslims. And they did, but a lot of them died in the route. The Byzantines were concerned about Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today. The Crusaders were interested in the Holy Land. So these are the kind of crosses that they wore. They would wear them outside of their on the outside part of their clothing so people could see it. It was a badge of honor, I guess, or commitment. This is why, for example, in the Muslim world, they don't have the Red Cross. They have the Red Crescent. Well, eventually they arrive in Jerusalem, the holy city, and they attack the city. Take Antioch in 1099, Jerusalem in 1099, Antioch in 1098. And here is a drawing. It's kind of hard to see. These are siege craft, wooden, that they built them, and they would push them up against the walls so they could get inside the city. It takes them 5 weeks of circling the city and laying siege to it, trying to starve the people out, attacking it, until they take the city. When they take the city and they get inside, they, by all accounts, are vicious. They kill basically everybody. Some of them are Christians, I think, end up dying. Certainly a lot of Muslims, even women and children. And so by the time they end up taking the city, they don't really have enough people to control the city. They had to go out in the countryside and try to recruit Christians from the countryside to come into the city and live. Keep the city functioning. So it was a terrible loss of life, no doubt about that. Sort of a tragic story, but they had accomplished their goal. They had liberated the Holy Land and brought it under Christian control. Okay? All right, so here is a map that shows you the Crusader states, they're sometimes called, or the Latin kingdoms in the Holy Land. There are 4 Latin states. The county of Edessa, way up there in the north. The Principality of Antioch. There's Edessa, there's Antioch. Here is Tripoli. That's the county of Tripoli. That's where Crac Chevalier is in that territory that I showed you earlier. And then, of course, the biggest one is called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it stretches from basically what would be Lebanon today all the way down to the Red Sea. I used to live in a castle right here, right next to the castle in Kerak. It's not on the map, but Crusader castle nonetheless. They can actually send signal fires between these castles and send a signal that they are in trouble or whatever to dispatch troops. Pretty interesting stuff. That's the first crusade. Let's go to the second crusade, shall we? Okay, we shall. This begins when Edessa falls. Edessa falls to the Muslims, a city way up in the north. Once this guy hears about it, his name is Bernard of Clairvaux. He's a monk. He's not an emperor. He's not a pope. He's a monk, and he says, you know what? The reason that fell is because we are sinful people. How are we going to make up for our sins? We need to repent, and we need to go on this crusade, and we need to conquer and win this city back. And this attracts two leaders. One is King Louis VII of France, or Louis, and then Emperor Conrad of Germany. By the way, Louis VII is probably maybe better known to you as Saint Louis. He was such a pious king that he was actually one of the few kings who was ever made into a saint. And so the city of St. Louis is named for him in Missouri, but also a lot of other things are named for him in France and so forth. So anyway, they go off to head to do this. However, it's a complete failure. They never make it even to the Middle East. And that's the end of that one. We don't have time to talk about it more than that. If you're really interested in Crusades, I do offer a course just on Crusades. But that's pretty specific. But I don't know when I'm offering it next, but talk to me if you're interested. Let's go to the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade, Jerusalem falls to the Muslims, to Salah al-Din in 1187. And of course, then this triggers a response. Now the holy city has fallen. And so three famous leaders, that's why it's sometimes called the King's Crusade. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Richard I, or better known as the Lion-Hearted of England, and King Philip II, or Philip Augustus of France. All these are contemporaneous kings. They all head off on this crusade at about the same time, and they're all going in response. Anybody know, Barbarossa was a nickname. Anybody know what that means? Barbarossa. Barbarossa. How about Rosa? What does Rosa mean? What would it mean in Spanish, Rosa? What's that? Pink? Well, yeah, it really means red in this case. Rosa. And Barbara. Anybody know what that means? What's that? Like Barbarossa, Barba. They sell something in the store called Barbasol. Anybody ever heard of that? Shaving cream, right? It comes from the Latin, two words. One is sol, solvent. One means beard. Barbasol means shaving or beard lotion. And this means red beard. Right? So that's his nickname. Well, he heads out. By the way, he drowns before he gets there. He drowns in a river. He's crossing. It's not a very, spectacular way to die. But he drowns in the river. He's wearing armor. He falls off, stumbles off his horse. Horse stumbles. He falls. They can't get him out before he drowns. At any rate, he drowns on the way. And most of his army leaves. So then that leaves Frederick out of the picture. And now we got Richard and we got France and England. Well, Richard and Philip often argue. They never got along. And now it's just the two of them. Eventually, Philip will just leave. After a few initial successes, he decides, I'm going back to France. And this leaves just Richard the Lion-Hearted by himself, who fights a battle at Acre and defeats Saladin there. And then he begins to approach Jerusalem. He's going to take the city. And then he decides that trying to hold this land was actually probably not going to be a long-term fix, because they just didn't have enough people. So he decided, this is Richard, to draw up an agreement with Saladin And in this agreement, Saladin would agree to allow pilgrims safe passage to the holy places, and Richard would leave. Richard would not attack Jerusalem. Saladin agreed to it. Most everybody said Saladin was a principled enemy, that he would keep his word, and he did. And this is the end of the Third Crusade. Jerusalem stays in the hands of the Muslims. Yes?
Which one was the one with all the kids?
With all the kids. I'm talking about the Children's Crusade. Are you trying to get ahead of me? It's coming. It's coming, man. Don't worry. All right, let's go. Here's the Third Crusade. Let me get to the Fourth Crusade, and then we'll get to the Children's Crusade. It's coming. I like this guy's hat. Nobody wore a good hat for Halloween. Well, no hats. Ghostbusters didn't really have hats. Yeah, I guess somebody did have a baseball cap, right? Wayne's World. Anyway, Innocent III, after Saladin dies, the pilgrims start to be attacked. And so the Pope, Innocent III, calls on a crusade. They make a deal, the Crusaders make a deal with the city of Venice, with the sailing ships there. And so they sort of contract with them, ships to carry them to the Holy Land. They decided they didn't want to march all the way there, go by sea. But when they show up, they didn't have enough men to pay. You know, they didn't have as many show up as they thought they'd have, and they still had this big bill. And they went to the guys of Venice and they said, hey, you know, we don't have enough money. Can we get a deal, get a reduction? They said, no, sorry. A deal's a deal. You're going to pay us, and we don't have the money. So, all right, I'll tell you what we'll do. You go and attack this other city for us. That's our rival, and we'll call it even. And so they attacked a couple of cities along the way, and then all these crusaders ended up in Constantinople. They actually took over Constantinople, and they never left. They stayed for 60 years, controlling the city of Constantinople. This is the original city that asked for help against being attacked. They now attack. Oh, of course it is a little bit late. So, the Byzantines will recapture in 1261, so you see it lasts about 60 years. And then the Byzantines will control Constantinople with a very small empire. It gets smaller and smaller. And Constantinople will finally fall in 1453 to the Turks, and the Byzantine Empire will be no more, and Constantinople will then be called Istanbul. Okay? All right, how are we doing? We're doing pretty good. Now we're coming to the requested crusade. In fact, here's my deal with this. I'm hoping somebody in here is a filmmaker. Anybody in here studying film? Anybody in here want to be a director, a producer, an actor? No? Okay. All right. Well, I've had this idea for many years. I've floated this idea for many, many years. I'm just hoping one of my students someday will make the film, and while they're making the film, they'll call upon me to be like a consultant so I can get in on it. Right? Here's how the film starts. We got a long shot of a hillside. Probably have to do with a helicopter or something, way up high. You're looking down and you can kind of see there are people there. They kind of look like ants. You start to zoom in and you see them walking, walking, walking. You zoom in even more and you can see their children. Children walking along this hilly path, this mountainous path. And in front, you see a teenager, probably 16, 17, leading them along this path. And then we kind of meet our main characters. We probably got about 4 of them. We got the guy who's running it. Then we can see we got 3 or 4 of the other followers that we'll focus in on to see what happens to them. Then, after we've established that establishment shot, I think is what they call that in the business, then we have a flashback. We flash back to the leader, and the leader is named Nicholas. Nicholas is back in Cologne, Germany, by the way. And he sees a vision. He hears something. He gets a calling where God tells him that he should lead the children of Europe like Moses led the children of Israel, and that the reason the Crusades have not been working is that these adults don't have enough faith. Remember, Jesus said, if you had faith like these little children, imagine what you could do. And so Nicholas says, okay, yes, Lord, I will follow you. I will lead the children, and we will take back the Holy Land for our Lord. So they begin to march. Thousands of children follow him. Much like the stories of the Pied Piper. Have you heard of the Pied Piper? Where the guy would come into town and all the children would follow him. That might be where these stories began. Children just begin, and he would tell them the story, and then the children would just fall into line. They would leave their homes. They wouldn't ask their parents. They would just take off, and they would start walking. And the story was, when they got to the water, when they got to the Mediterranean, guess what? The water was going to part, like the Red Sea had parted for the children of Israel. And Moses had led them across. And they were going to be led across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land on dry ground. Pretty good stuff, huh? You like this movie so far? Getting you interested? Of course, we got to get the right actors. You know, we get like Justin Bieber to be the leader of it or something. People want to watch. All right. Then we go down. They go down the Rhine River Valley. They cross the Alps, and then, you know, telling this story about what's going to happen. Now we cut a scene to Rome. The Pope is notified there are thousands and thousands of children that say they're going on a crusade. The Pope is outraged. He can't believe it. He says, send the message, send my legates, tell them these children must go home. This is not what God wants them to do. Go back to your parents, go back to your homes. Kids don't listen. You know how they are. They keep marching. They believe God would part the sea. When they got to the sea, guess what? He didn't. He didn't part the sea. The water's still there. That disappoints a lot of the kids. Maybe one of our, we got our leader who focused on him. We got one of our four decides, I'm out of here. I thought this was going to happen. It didn't happen. Many go home. But some say, no, we still believe. Maybe we just didn't interpret it right. We still believe. God's going to get us there. So they go to Marseille. When they get to Marseille, much to their, here's a drawing of the Children's Crusade. I kind of like that little painting. Ship owners in the city of Marseille said, I'll tell you what, kids, we've heard that you want to get to the Holy Land. We believe in you. We believe in you. So here's what we're ready to do. We're going to sail you there for free. You just get on our ships. We'll sail you right there. Everything will be fine. So 7 ships leave the harbor. Can you imagine? 3 of our young heroes on the ships. They're not all on the same ship. And they're singing songs, and they're heading out. And they're happy. God has provided a way. We're off to win the Holy Land and to take it from the infidels and restore it to Christians. But they get out on the Mediterranean, and a terrible storm comes up, and the waves are crashing, and the ships are reeling in it, and then 2 of them sink, and 2 of our heroes die on the ships. We've still got a couple heroes and our leader. 5 more ships. The 5 more ships keep sailing on, pressing onward, until they arrive in North Africa, where the ship owners sell them as slaves to the Muslims. The end. So it's a happy ending. Now, what we could do is maybe have some of our heroes, maybe one of them eventually escapes and comes back and tell the story. It could all be, tell us the story of the Children's Crusade. Now, this is one version. There are more than one version of this, but this is the one I like. This is the one I want to make into a movie. I got the outline for you. All he needs is a script. All he needs is like millions of dollars. That's no problem. I think people would go for it. All right, maybe not. Now, there were more crusades, but none of them were really successful. We don't have time to talk about all of them. Most of them did not ever reach the Middle East. A couple of them reached Egypt. Well, what are the results then of the Crusades? What are some of the things that happened because of the Crusades? One of them is we see that Europe gains trading bases in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. They are also exposed to a lot of new products. You know, one of the things they brought back from the Middle East were relics. A bunch of relics, right? And those became very important because they were thought to carry spiritual value. In other words, a piece of the true cross. They brought back a lot of pieces of the true cross. Guys had them for sale. Say, don't you want to take home a piece of the true cross? This is the cross upon which Jesus hung. And so they did. And it was once said that they brought back so many pieces of the true cross to Europe that they could have built Noah's Ark. And lots of other items like that. You still go to the Holy Land, they'll still sell you relics today. When you go with me next summer to Israel, I will take you to places in the old city where you can buy all kinds of things. Holy things. All right? I think another very interesting thing that happens is the military monastic orders begin. Because remember, these guys who go on the Crusades aren't really making any money. It's costing them money. They got to leave their estates back home, which makes them vulnerable. They got to spend money to go. They might die doing it along with a lot of their people. And then when they get there, they're really not making any money. So it's a costly venture. So a lot of them don't want to do it. So in the end, what ends up happening is that monks are trained to be soldiers, and they are sent. Why? Because monks don't need money. They take a vow of poverty. Remember we talked about that. They take a vow of chastity. They don't have a family. They're not leaving a family behind. They're not leaving a state behind. And they will go and fight. And so we see 3 monastic orders set up. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights. And these guys really fulfill a lot of what is needed when we get to trying to control the Crusader states. But here's the problem. Once the Crusader states fall, and they will fall, what do you do with these guys? Pretty dangerous to have guys who don't have a family and don't need money and are just trained to fight hanging around. And so a lot of them are in fact sometimes falsely accused, like the Knights Templar, of doing things. So they try to isolate them. They put them off on islands and stuff to try to keep them out of the way. But another thing that happens is we have new ideas and new writings that come from the East, and that begins to change the way people think. One of the things that's going to change will be the introduction of classical writings into the teachings of the church. For example, the writings of Aristotle and a school of thought of Aristotle will create scholasticism. It's going to look at logic, argumentation, and the kinds of the ways that Aristotle thought about things rather than Plato. So they began to debate over very small issues. For example, a famous one is, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Well, the answer is, I guess, a lot, because they don't take up any space. But anyway, who knows? And some might say, who cares? But these are the kinds of minute things that began to argue from logic and philosophy that are there. Emerging out of this comes then in this high Middle Ages period, probably the finest mind, or certainly the most influential mind of this period, and his name is Thomas Aquinas, a scholastic theologian, a thinker, an author. But by the way, you know what his schoolmates called him? A dumb ox. Because he was big and clumsy and they didn't think he was very smart. But the guy was very smart. He was influenced by Aristotle, and he writes his magnum opus in Latin. His great work was his Summa Theologica, or his summary of theology. It was a systematic view of theology. And when I say that this was very influential in the Roman Catholic Church, that's an understatement. This became the basis of Roman Catholic theology for hundreds of years. And to be quite honest, still today people react to it. You know, most everybody studying theology at least studies what Thomas had to say and his school of thought. Well, we'll end it there for today.